Chapter 1. A Dream Becomes Reality. In the year 1909, the city of Belfast was alive with excitement. Crowds gathered near the Harland and Wolff shipyard, their eyes wide with wonder. Something extraordinary was happening. A ship like no other was being built. It would be the largest, the strongest, and the most beautiful ship the world had ever seen. Its name was Titanic. Thousands of workers came to the shipyard every day. They carried their tools and climbed the scaffolding. Hammers rang and sparks flew as metal plates were welded together. The work was hard. The days were long. But the workers were proud. They were building something great. Something that would be remembered forever. Titanic was no ordinary ship. It was a masterpiece. At over 269 meters long, it was larger than any other ship afloat. It was built to carry more than 2,000 passengers across the Atlantic Ocean. The ship's designers called it unsinkable. They believed nothing could bring it down. Inside, Titanic was even more amazing. The first-class cabins were like rooms in a palace. They had soft carpets, shining mirrors, and golden light fixtures. There was a grand staircase with a glass dome that let sunlight pour in. The dining room could seat hundreds of guests at once. There were libraries, swimming pools, and even a gym. No one had seen anything like it before. For the workers, building Titanic was a great challenge. Each piece had to fit perfectly. The ship had to be strong enough to survive the ocean's power. Engineers and architects worked late into the night, checking every detail. But they also dreamed. They dreamed of the day the Titanic would sail. They believed it would change the world. Yet, there were whispers in the shipyard. Some workers said the Titanic was too big, too heavy. They worried about the iceberg warnings that sailors often spoke of. Others laughed and said, "Nothing can sink this ship." Confidence filled the air. But behind that confidence, there was a quiet fear. A fear that no one dared to speak out loud. The Titanic grew taller and taller. By 1911, the hull was complete. It shone like a giant steel mountain. Thousands of people gathered to watch as it was launched into the water for the first time. The crowd cheered and waved as the ship slid into the River Lagan. The ship of dreams, they called it. It was a ship meant for kings and queens, for the rich and powerful. But it was also a ship for dreamers, for people looking for a new life in America. In the months that followed, workers finished the ship's interior. Painters decorated the walls with fine patterns. Carpenters built furniture that looked like it belonged in a castle. Every detail was perfect. Every piece shone with luxury. But not everyone working on the Titanic felt the same excitement. William, a young carpenter, often looked worried. He was proud of his work, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, as the sun set over Belfast, he stood on the deck and stared at the horizon. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "But is she too proud?" His friend, Thomas, laughed. "Proud? She's perfect. Stop worrying, William. This ship will make history." William smiled, but didn't reply. Deep down, he felt a strange unease. The people of Belfast felt proud too. The Titanic was not just a ship, it was a symbol of human ambition, of what people could achieve with hard work and dreams. Newspapers around the world wrote about it. The Titanic is a modern wonder, they said. A ship of the future. By the spring of 1912, everything was ready. The Titanic was complete. The workers stood back and admired their creation. They had spent 3 years building the ship, 3 years of sweat and effort. Now it was time for the Titanic to leave Belfast and head to Southampton, where it would begin its first voyage. As the ship sailed out of the shipyard, crowds lined the streets. Families waved flags. Children cheered. For many, it was the greatest day of their lives. The Titanic was not just a ship. It was a dream of safety, wealth, and progress. But not everyone celebrated. Some old sailors shook their heads as the Titanic passed. Too big, they muttered. Too fast. They remembered the dangers of the sea. They remembered the icebergs. For Captain Edward Smith, the Titanic was the peak of his career. He was an experienced and respected captain, known for his calm nature. As he watched the ship leave Belfast, he smiled. "She is ready," he said. "She will sail to New York in style. Nothing can stop her." Yet even Captain Smith couldn't see what lay ahead. The Titanic was a triumph of human ambition, but it also carried the weight of human pride. Beneath its shining surface, there were flaws that no one wanted to admit. The ship sailed smoothly toward Southampton, its funnels releasing clouds of black smoke into the sky. Inside, the Titanic was quiet and empty, waiting for its first passengers. Soon, it would be full of life. Soon, it would carry the hopes and dreams of more than 2,000 people. But for now, it rested. Calm. Silent. Beautiful. The Titanic was ready. Its journey was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Floating Palace. It was 1912. At last, the Titanic was ready. The ship stood tall and proud at the dock in Southampton. Its 4 large funnels reached for the sky. The black and white hull gleamed in the sunlight. People stopped and stared. They had never seen anything so big, so beautiful. Excitement buzzed in the air. Passengers arrived, holding their tickets tightly. Porters carried heavy suitcases. Journalists took photos. The Titanic was the most famous ship in the world, and everyone wanted to see it. The rich passengers were the first to board. Men in fine suits and women in long dresses walked up the gangway. Their luggage was full of elegant clothes, jewelry, and even perfumes. Many of them smiled as they saw their first-class cabins. These were not just cabins. They were luxurious suites. Some had their own private decks. Others had bathtubs made of marble. The beds were soft, and the curtains were heavy and rich. "This is more beautiful than my own home," said Lady Margaret, a wealthy woman from London. She laughed as she opened her suitcase. "I might never want to leave." The centerpiece of the Titanic's luxury was the grand staircase. Its steps were polished wood, and its railing was decorated with gold. At the top was a large glass dome. Sunlight poured in, making the staircase shine. Passengers stopped to admire it. They took photographs and whispered, "This is the most beautiful ship in the world." But first class was not the only part of the Titanic. Down below, in third class, passengers had simpler cabins. These rooms were small and plain. Most had bunk beds and shared bathrooms. Yet, the third-class passengers were still happy. For many, this was their first time on a ship. For others, it was their chance to start a new life. Anna, a young woman from Poland, sat on her bed in third class. She looked at her little brother, Peter. He was just 7 years old and already full of excitement. "We are going to America," Peter shouted. "We will have a big house, just like the rich people." Anna smiled and hugged him. "Maybe not a big house," she said softly, "but a better life." Around them, other families were talking, laughing, and making plans. Some were farmers hoping for new land. Others were workers looking for better jobs. They didn't have gold staircases or marble bathtubs, but they carried something more important: hope. The Titanic had everything a person could dream of. Its dining rooms were fit for kings and queens. The first-class dining room had long tables covered with white cloths. There were silver plates, crystal glasses, and tall candelabras. Waiters in white jackets stood ready to serve fine food, like oysters and roast duck. In third class, the food was simpler, but still good. Passengers ate hearty meals of bread, soup, and meat pies. For many, it was more than they were used to. The ship also had many modern wonders. There was a heated swimming pool, a gym with electric machines, and even a squash court. First-class passengers could relax in a Turkish bath or read in a quiet library. There were telephones and electric lights in every room. Some people said the Titanic was not just a ship. It was a floating palace. As passengers explored, the ship's crew worked hard. There were over 800 men and women on the staff. Some were engineers who kept the engines running. Others were stewards who cleaned rooms and served meals. The captain, Edward Smith, was calm and confident. He had been a sailor for over 40 years and knew the ocean well. Captain Smith stood on the bridge and looked out at the busy dock. "This is the finest ship I've ever commanded," he said. "Nothing can stop her." But not everyone shared the captain's confidence. Down in the boiler rooms, the stokers worked in the heat and noise. These men shoveled coal into the ship's massive engines. The work was backbreaking, and the air was thick with smoke. Some of them worried about the size of the ship. "If something goes wrong," one man muttered, "how will we fix it?" Still, the mood on board was cheerful. Families laughed as they walked along the decks. Children played games and waved at seagulls. The ship felt like a world of its own, full of life and promise. As evening fell, the Titanic prepared to leave Southampton. The sky turned pink and orange as the sun set. On the docks, people waved goodbye to their loved ones. Some smiled and shouted, "Safe journey." Others wiped tears from their eyes. Anna stood by the railing, holding Peter's hand. She waved at her uncle, who had come to see them off. "Goodbye," she called. "We will write to you from America." Nearby, Lady Margaret stood with her husband. She smiled and adjusted her hat. "This will be the grandest voyage of our lives," she said. "We are lucky to be part of history." The ship's whistle blew, loud and deep. The sound echoed over the water. Slowly, the Titanic began to move. People on the dock cheered and waved their hats. Passengers leaned over the railings, looking back at the shore. Some waved. Others stayed silent, watching as their old lives disappeared into the distance. The Titanic glided through the water, its lights glowing in the dark. Inside, the passengers settled into their cabins. Some unpacked their bags. Others went to the dining rooms or lounges. Musicians played soft tunes, and the sound of laughter filled the air. But as the ship sailed away, a quiet unease lingered. Not everyone could forget the dangers of the sea. Icebergs had been reported in the North Atlantic, and though the Titanic was called unsinkable, some passengers couldn't help but wonder, was any ship truly safe? For now, the Titanic moved steadily toward its destination. It was a picture of beauty and power. But beneath the surface, questions remained. Would the floating palace complete its journey? Or was its story just beginning? Chapter 3. A Voyage to Remember. It was April 10th, 1912, a bright morning in Southampton. The Titanic stood at the dock, tall and majestic. Its 4 great funnels rose high into the sky. Smoke curled into the air. Crowds of people gathered to see the ship off. The excitement was electric. Passengers arrived early, carrying suitcases and boxes. Some wore fine clothes with shiny shoes and elegant hats. Others wore simple dresses or old coats. But everyone, rich or poor, had one thing in common. They were ready for a journey they would never forget. At 12 Rousseau p.m., the ship's whistle blew. It was deep and loud, like a roar. People on the dock waved and shouted. Some passengers leaned over the railings to wave back. The Titanic's engines rumbled to life. Slowly, the giant ship began to move. As the Titanic sailed away, the passengers felt a mix of emotions. Some laughed and cheered. Others wiped away tears. Families hugged each other and promised to write letters. "Goodbye, England," shouted a young boy. "Next stop, America." On board, the mood was cheerful. In first class, passengers gathered on the deck, taking photographs with their cameras. Ladies sipped tea while chatting about the voyage. "This ship is a marvel," said one man. "I've never seen anything like it." Children ran up and down the wooden deck. They played games and stared in awe at the ship's enormous size. "It's like a floating city," said Peter, a 7-year-old boy traveling with his sister Anna. He held her hand tightly, his eyes wide with excitement. Anna smiled but said nothing. She was thinking about the future, about the new life waiting for them in America. In third class, the atmosphere was lively. Families gathered in their cabins, unpacking their belongings. Many had never seen such a big ship before. The children giggled as they explored the narrow hallways. Mothers called them back, saying, "Stay close." But their excitement was impossible to contain. The Titanic's first day at sea was smooth and calm. The weather was clear, and the ocean sparkled in the sunlight. In the afternoon, passengers walked along the decks. Some relaxed in the lounges, reading books or writing letters. Others explored the ship, admiring its beauty. Everywhere there was laughter and joy. Musicians played lively tunes in the first-class lounge. Couples danced, their footsteps light and graceful. In third class, families sang songs and told stories. The Titanic felt alive, full of dreams and hope. But below deck, the work never stopped. In the engine rooms, stokers shoveled coal into the massive furnaces. Sweat poured down their faces as they worked in the heat. The engines roared, powering the Titanic forward. "She's a beast," said one stoker, wiping his brow. "But she's running smooth." Captain Edward Smith stood on the bridge, looking out at the calm sea. He was a tall man with a white beard and kind eyes. This was his last voyage before retirement. "A fine ship," he said to his officers, "the finest I've ever sailed." By evening, the ship was far from shore. The sky turned pink and orange as the sun set. Passengers gathered on deck to watch. Couples held hands, and children pointed at the horizon. "It's beautiful," whispered Anna, watching the sky turn dark. Peter yawned and leaned against her shoulder. "When will we see America?" he asked. "Soon," Anna replied softly. "Very soon." That night, the Titanic was filled with life. In the first-class dining room, passengers enjoyed a grand feast. Waiters served dishes like caviar, roast duck, and rich desserts. The room sparkled with chandeliers, and the air was filled with laughter. In third class, dinner was simpler, but just as enjoyable. Plates of stew and fresh bread were passed around. People shared stories of their lives and dreams. A young man named John played a fiddle, and soon the room was filled with music. But not everyone felt at ease. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked late into the night. They sent messages from passengers to their families back home. The machine clicked and buzzed. Occasionally, they received warnings of ice ahead. Jack frowned and wrote them down. "More icebergs," he muttered. But the warnings didn't seem urgent. At midnight, the ship was quiet. Most passengers had gone to bed, their cabins dark and still. A few stayed awake, walking the deck under the stars. The ocean stretched out endlessly, black and calm. The Titanic sailed on, steady and strong. But far ahead, the Atlantic hid its secrets. Icebergs floated silently in the cold waters. They were massive and white, their edges sharp like glass. The sea around them was freezing, deadly. The Titanic was moving fast, unaware of what lay ahead. In her cabin, Anna lay awake, listening to Peter's soft breathing. She felt a mix of emotions, excitement, hope, and a little fear. The Titanic felt safe, like a fortress, but she couldn't stop a small voice in her mind that whispered, "What if something goes wrong?" For now, the ship moved forward, cutting through the water like a knife. The passengers slept peacefully, dreaming of the future. The Titanic was a marvel of human ambition, a symbol of progress. But even the strongest dreams can be fragile. The voyage continued. The sea was calm. The stars shone brightly in the sky. Everything seemed perfect. Yet the icy waters of the Atlantic hid a terrible secret. And soon, the Titanic's passengers and crew would discover it. Chapter 4. Life on Board. The days on the Titanic were magical. The ship sailed smoothly over the calm blue sea. The sun shone brightly, and the air was fresh and cool. Passengers wandered the decks, smiling and chatting. It felt like a dream. In first class, life was luxurious. Men in suits and women in elegant dresses sat in the lounges. They sipped tea from fine china and talked about their plans in America. Some played cards, while others read books in the quiet library. The grand dining room was the heart of first-class life. At every meal, waiters served delicious food on silver plates. Lobster, roast beef, and creamy soups filled the tables. The chandeliers sparkled, and the room buzzed with laughter and conversation. After dinner, there was always entertainment. Musicians played soft, elegant music. Couples danced under the golden lights. A few passengers gathered by the piano, singing together. "This ship is like a palace," said Lady Margaret. "I don't want this journey to end." But the first-class passengers weren't the only ones enjoying the voyage. In third class, the mood was different, but just as lively. Families gathered in the common rooms, playing cards and telling stories. Children laughed as they chased each other down the narrow hallways. Meals in third class were simple but hearty. There was plenty of bread, soup, and stew. For many passengers, it was better than the food they were used to at home. "This is a feast," said a young man named John as he ate with his family. "I could get used to this." Anna and Peter spent most of their time exploring. They walked along the decks, looking out at the endless ocean. Peter liked to count the lifeboats hanging on the sides of the ship. "There are so many," he said. "Enough for everyone, right?" Anna hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Peter, enough for everyone." She wasn't sure if it was true, but she didn't want to worry her little brother. The ship's crew worked hard to keep everything running smoothly. Stewards cleaned cabins, served meals, and helped passengers with their needs. Engineers and stokers kept the engines running, shoveling coal into the roaring furnaces. The captain and officers watched the ship's course carefully, checking maps and instruments. One evening, as the ship sailed under a blanket of stars, a strange warning arrived. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were busy sending messages for passengers. Suddenly, a sharp signal came through. Jack frowned as he read the words, "Ice ahead." He scribbled the message on a piece of paper and sent it to the bridge. The officers read it and exchanged uneasy glances. But the Titanic was traveling fast, and the sea seemed calm. "We'll keep an eye out," one officer said. Below deck, the stokers were working hard, as always. The heat from the furnaces was intense, and sweat dripped down their faces. One stoker, a man named Thomas, wiped his brow and muttered, "This ship is too big. If something happens, how will we stop it?" "Nothing will happen," said another. "She's unsinkable, remember?" Thomas didn't reply. He looked at the ceiling above him, thinking about the passengers sleeping peacefully in their cabins. He shook his head and returned to his work. The next day, life on the Titanic continued as usual. Passengers walked along the decks, enjoying the fresh sea breeze. Children played games, and couples sat together, watching the waves. The ship felt like its own little world, safe and separate from everything else. In first class, Lady Margaret was preparing for dinner. She stood in front of a large mirror, fixing her hair. "What a beautiful night," she said to her husband. "We're so lucky to be here." In third class, Anna helped Peter get ready for bed. He yawned and climbed into his small bunk. "Will we see America tomorrow?" he asked. "Not yet," Anna said with a smile. "But soon. Now go to sleep." Peter closed his eyes, and Anna sat by the window. She looked out at the dark ocean, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. The Titanic felt strong, unshakable, but the sea was vast and mysterious. It made her feel small. Later that night, the wireless room received another warning. Jack Phillips read the message quickly. "Icebergs in the area. Proceed with caution." He shook his head and placed the message with the others. The Titanic was still moving fast. Too fast, some might say. The officers on the bridge scanned the horizon, but the night was quiet. The sea was calm, almost unnaturally so. The stars shone brightly, reflecting on the dark water. There was no sign of danger. By midnight, most of the passengers were asleep. The grand dining room was empty. The music had stopped, and the lights in the lounges were dim. Only a few people were awake, walking the decks or talking quietly in their cabins. Anna lay in her bed, listening to the gentle hum of the engines. Peter was fast asleep, his small hand clutching the blanket. She thought about the new life waiting for them in America. She thought about the promise of safety and hope. But deep in her heart, she couldn't shake a tiny whisper of fear. What if something goes wrong? The Titanic sailed on, cutting through the black ocean. Its lights glowed softly in the night. The passengers and crew trusted the ship completely. It was strong, it was modern, it was unsinkable. But the icy waters of the Atlantic were full of secrets, and the Titanic was heading straight toward one of them. Chapter 5. A Cold, Quiet Night. It was April 14th, 1912. The Titanic sailed smoothly through the Atlantic. The night was cold, but the sea was calm. The stars above were bright and clear. The ship's lights glowed softly like a floating city in the dark. Captain Edward Smith stood on the bridge. He watched the horizon and took a deep breath. This was his last voyage before retirement. Everything seemed perfect. The ship was steady and the ocean was quiet. He felt proud of the Titanic. It was the finest ship he had ever commanded. Below the bridge, passengers were settling in for the night. Some stayed awake, enjoying the cool breeze on the deck. A few women wrapped themselves in blankets as they watched the stars. Couples walked hand in hand, whispering about their future in America. The mood was peaceful. In third class, families prepared for bed. Children snuggled under warm blankets. Mothers tucked them in, their voices soft and comforting. Anna sat by the window in her small cabin. Peter was already asleep, his head resting on her lap. She looked out at the endless dark sea. The stillness made her uneasy. Why is it so quiet? She wondered. Far below, in the engine rooms, the work never stopped. The stokers shoveled coal into the furnaces, their faces covered in sweat and soot. The engines roared, pushing the Titanic forward. Thomas, one of the stokers, wiped his brow and sighed. A quiet sea is never a good sign, he muttered to himself. At 9:40 p.m., a message came into the wireless room. Jack Phillips, the senior wireless operator, read it quickly. Ice ahead. Large bergs reported in the area. He frowned but didn't stop working. The room was busy. Passengers were sending messages to loved ones, and he had to keep up. Jack placed the warning on the stack of messages for the captain. Up on the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch kept a careful eye on the horizon. He had heard about the ice warnings earlier that day. The air was unusually cold, too cold. He glanced at the temperature gauge and shook his head. Ice is near, he thought. But where? At 10:30 p.m., another warning came in. This one was more urgent. We are surrounded by ice, it read. The wireless operator on the nearby ship, Californian, tried to warn the Titanic, but Jack Phillips, busy with passenger messages, brushed it off. I'm too busy, he said, frustrated. The warning was never delivered to the bridge. The Titanic sailed on, unaware of what lay ahead. Its speed remained high, over 22 knots. Captain Smith wanted to impress the world by arriving in New York early. The ship was built to be fast, and he trusted it completely. By 11:30 p.m., the temperature had dropped even more. The deck was freezing, and frost covered the railings. A few passengers still walked outside, but most had gone to bed. The stars reflected on the dark water, creating an eerie, endless blackness. At the front of the ship, in the crow's nest, two lookouts stood watch. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee scanned the horizon. The night was so clear, but there was no moon. The darkness made it hard to see far. Suddenly Fleet squinted. Something was ahead. something big and white. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet rang the warning bell 3 times. "Iceberg right ahead," he shouted. His voice echoed through the cold air. The message reached the bridge instantly. First Officer Murdoch acted fast. "Hard to starboard," he ordered. The ship began to turn, but it was too big, too heavy. It couldn't move quickly enough. The iceberg loomed closer. It was silent and massive, like a ghost in the dark. The Titanic scraped along its side with a terrible sound. Metal groaned and twisted. Passengers felt a strange vibration beneath their feet. Some woke up, confused. Others stayed asleep, unaware. In her cabin, Anna felt a jolt. She sat up, her heart pounding. Peter stirred and opened his eyes. "What was that?" he asked sleepily. "I don't know," Anna whispered, "but stay here. I'll check." She stepped into the hallway. Other passengers were coming out of their cabins, looking worried. "Did we hit something?" someone asked. "Is everything all right?" A steward walked by, calm but firm. "Nothing to worry about," he said. "Go back to bed." But below deck, the situation was much worse. Water poured into the lower compartments. The iceberg had torn a massive hole in the ship's side. Engineers and crew members worked frantically to pump the water out, but it was coming in too fast. Captain Smith was called to the bridge. He listened as the chief engineer explained the damage. The news was shocking. 5 compartments were flooding. The Titanic was designed to survive 4, but not 5. Slowly, the truth sank in. The ship was doomed. The captain gave his orders. "Prepare the lifeboats," he said quietly. "Send out a distress signal." His voice was steady, but his face was pale. He knew what this meant. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride began sending SOS messages. "We are sinking," they wrote. "Need help immediately." Their hands trembled as they worked. Ships nearby received the signals, but were too far to arrive quickly. Above deck, passengers were still unaware of the danger. Some joked about the iceberg. "We gave it a good bump," one man laughed. Others put on their coats and stepped outside to see what had happened. Anna returned to her cabin and found Peter sitting up. "We need to go, Peter," she said. Her voice shook, but she tried to sound calm. "Put on your shoes, quickly." The Titanic's great lights shone into the night, but the icy water was rising. Officers shouted as the crew prepared the lifeboats. "Women and children first," they called. Panic was starting to spread. Far away, the Californian sat motionless in the ice. Its wireless operator had gone to bed, and no one saw the Titanic's distress rockets. Help would not come quickly. The Titanic, once so strong and proud, was now wounded and vulnerable. It tilted slightly, the bow dipping into the freezing sea. The night that had begun so peacefully was now filled with fear. Anna held Peter's hand tightly as they made their way to the deck. She looked up at the stars and whispered a silent prayer. The Titanic's journey was coming to an end, but for its passengers, the fight for survival had just begun. Before we begin Chapter 6, A quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on WooEnglish. Remember, this content is specially made for WooEnglish listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of WooEnglish's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6. The Iceberg. It was a cold, clear night on April 14th, 1912. The Titanic moved swiftly through the Atlantic. The sea was calm, and the stars shone brightly. Most passengers were asleep. Some stayed up, enjoying the quiet beauty of the night. In the crow's nest, high above the deck, 2 lookouts scanned the horizon. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee had been on watch for hours. They wore thick coats, but the icy wind still bit at their faces. The sea looked smooth and endless, but they knew it hid dangers. They had been warned about icebergs earlier that day. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet suddenly froze. He saw something ahead, something big. It was white and hard to see in the dark. His heart raced. He grabbed the bell and rang it 3 times, a warning. Then he picked up the phone and called the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead!" Fleet shouted. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch reacted immediately. "Hard to starboard," he ordered. The helmsman turned the wheel sharply. Murdoch pulled a lever to stop the engines. He hoped it would slow the ship. But the Titanic was massive. It couldn't turn quickly enough. Seconds passed like hours. The iceberg came closer and closer. The crew held their breath. Then, it happened. The iceberg scraped along the side of the Titanic with a terrible sound. It was a long, low grinding noise. Metal screeched as it tore apart. Passengers felt the vibration. Some woke up, startled. Others thought it was just the ship's engines. In the dining room, a few plates fell from the tables and shattered on the floor. A man sitting by the window frowned. "What was that?" he asked. His wife laughed nervously. "Probably nothing," she said. But it wasn't nothing. The iceberg had ripped a massive hole in the ship's hull. Water rushed into the lower compartments. It came fast and cold, flooding the spaces where the crew slept and worked. In the boiler rooms, the stokers shouted in alarm. They grabbed their tools and ran as the freezing water chased them. Thomas, a stoker, stumbled as the water reached his feet. "Get out!" he yelled to the others. "She's taking in water fast." His voice echoed in the chaos. Above deck, most passengers still didn't know what had happened. Some were getting dressed, curious about the strange noise. Others stayed in their cabins, thinking it wasn't serious. A few stepped outside and noticed chunks of ice on the deck. They laughed and picked them up. In her cabin, Anna woke to the sound of voices in the hallway. Peter was already sitting up, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" he asked. "I don't know," Anna said, pulling on her coat. "Stay here. I'll find out." But as she opened the door, a steward walked by. "Put on your life jackets," he said firmly, "just in case." Anna's heart sank. Life jackets? That didn't sound good. On the bridge, Captain Edward Smith arrived. His face was pale. Murdoch explained what had happened. The iceberg, the crash, the water flooding the ship. Smith listened in silence. Then he turned to the engineer. "How bad is it?" the captain asked. The engineer shook his head. "5 compartments are flooding. She can't stay afloat." Smith's chest tightened. He knew what that meant. The Titanic, the unsinkable ship, was sinking. "Prepare the lifeboats," the captain ordered. His voice was calm, but his hands trembled. "Send out distress signals." In the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked quickly. They tapped out messages, hoping other ships would hear them. "SOS, we are sinking. Need help immediately." Their hands moved fast, but they knew time was running out. On the lower decks, the situation was growing worse. Water poured in, cold and relentless. Crew members shouted as they tried to help passengers. Some people panicked, running toward the stairs. Others stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Anna helped Peter into his coat and boots. She tied a life jacket around his small body. "Are we going swimming?" Peter asked, confused. "No, Peter," Anna said softly. "We're going outside. Hold my hand and don't let go." They joined the crowd moving toward the deck. People whispered to each other, their faces filled with fear. Some held children. Others clutched small bags, trying to save their most precious belongings. When they reached the deck, the cold air hit them like a slap. Anna shivered and held Peter close. Officers were shouting. "Women and children first," they called. "Get to the lifeboats." Lifeboats hung along the sides of the ship. Crew members worked quickly to lower them into the water, but there weren't enough. The Titanic carried over 2,000 people, and the lifeboats could only hold about half. Lady Margaret, dressed in a fur coat, stood near one of the lifeboats. She clung to her husband's arm. "I won't leave without you," she said firmly. "You must go," he replied. "I'll be fine. They'll send more boats." Tears filled her eyes as a crew member helped her into the lifeboat. She looked up at her husband one last time. "Promise me you'll follow," she whispered. "I promise," he said, but they both knew it wasn't true. The Titanic began to tilt slightly. The bow dipped lower into the water. Passengers felt the change and gasped. Some began to cry. Others shouted for help. Anna and Peter moved toward a lifeboat. A crew member stopped them. "Women and children only," he said, lifting Peter into the boat. Anna hesitated. "I can't leave him," she said. "You have to," the man replied. "There's no time." Peter reached for her, his eyes wide with fear. "Anna, don't let go." "I'll find another boat," she said, her voice breaking. "I promise." The lifeboat lowered into the freezing water. Anna stood on the deck, watching it drift away. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay calm. She had to stay strong. For Peter. The Titanic's great lights still shone, but the ship was sinking. The once mighty vessel groaned under the weight of the water. Above, the stars sparkled in the cold, dark sky. The passengers who remained faced an impossible choice. Wait for rescue, or jump into the icy sea. The Titanic was in danger, and so was everyone on board. Chapter 7. Panic and Courage. The Titanic tilted slightly in the freezing Atlantic waters. The truth was clear now. The ship was sinking. Captain Smith stood on the bridge, his face pale. The crew looked to him for orders. He raised his hand and spoke firmly. Prepare the lifeboats. Women and children first. The crew spread across the decks, shouting the captain's orders. Lifeboats are ready! Women and children first! Passengers began to gather. Some looked calm, holding on to hope. Others whispered nervously. A few panicked, their eyes wide with fear. The lifeboats were lowered one by one. The crew worked quickly, but it wasn't easy. The ropes were heavy, and the ship was still moving. On the deck, officers helped women and children into the small boats. Mothers kissed their husbands goodbye. Children cried, reaching for fathers who couldn't join them. Anna stood near the edge of the deck, watching Peter's lifeboat drift further into the dark sea. Her heart felt heavy, but she knew she couldn't give up. I'll find another boat, she whispered to herself. She turned and moved through the crowd, searching for a way to survive. Nearby, Lady Margaret was being helped into a lifeboat. Tears streamed down her face. Please, she begged the officer, let my husband come with me. I'm sorry, ma'am, he replied. Women and children only. Her husband stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. Go, he said softly. You must. I can't, she cried. But the officer lifted her gently into the boat. She reached out for her husband, but the lifeboat began to lower. I love you, she shouted. I love you too, he called back, his voice breaking. The ship tilted further, and the panic grew. Passengers scrambled to find loved ones. A young man shouted for his wife, his voice filled with desperation. A mother held her baby tightly, refusing to let go. Friends and families were separated in the chaos. But amidst the fear, there were moments of bravery. The crew worked tirelessly, even though they knew the danger. Some stewards knocked on cabin doors, waking passengers and guiding them to safety. Others helped people into life jackets, staying calm in the face of terror. The band, led by Wallace Hartley, gathered on the deck. They began to play music. Their instruments filled the cold air with calm, gentle sounds. Passengers stopped to listen. Some cried, touched by the beauty of the music. Others felt comforted, even if only for a moment. Anna found herself near one of the last lifeboats. An officer stood by, shouting instructions. The boat was almost full. Anna stepped forward, but the officer raised his hand. No more room, he said. Next boat. Anna's heart sank. The lifeboat began to lower, and she watched it disappear into the dark waters. She felt lost, unsure of what to do next. The ship's lights still shone brightly, but the icy sea was rising fast. On the other side of the deck, a group of men worked to free a collapsible lifeboat. It was stuck, and the ropes wouldn't budge. Thomas, the stoker, was among them. His hands were rough and blistered from years of work, but he didn't stop. "Come on!" he shouted. "We need to get this boat down." Another man joined them. He wore a fine suit, but rolled up his sleeves to help. Together, they pulled at the ropes. The lifeboat finally came loose, and they cheered. Women and children climbed in quickly. Thomas stayed behind, waving them off. "Save yourselves," he said. He knew there wouldn't be a place for him. The Titanic's bow dipped lower, and the ship tilted more sharply. People began to fall. Some slid across the deck, screaming. Others held onto railings, their knuckles white with fear. The crew tried to keep order, but the panic was too great. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride continued to send distress signals. SOS, SOS, Titanic sinking, need help immediately. Their hands shook, but they didn't stop. Nearby, an officer entered the room. "You've done enough," he said. "Save yourselves?" Jack shook his head. "Not yet." He kept tapping the message, hoping someone would hear. Anna moved toward another lifeboat. This one was almost full. She saw a young mother struggling to climb in. Her child clung to her neck, crying. Anna stepped forward and helped them. "Hold on tight," she said, as the officer pulled them into the boat. The officer turned to Anna. "You too," he said, holding out his hand. But Anna shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "I need to find my brother." The officer hesitated, then nodded. The lifeboat lowered, leaving Anna behind. She stood on the deck, her breath visible in the icy air. She felt alone, but she wasn't ready to give up. The band played on, their music steady and calm. One of the musicians looked at Wallace Hartley. "Should we go?" he asked quietly. Wallace shook his head. "No, we'll stay." He raised his violin and began to play "Nearer, My God, to Thee." The others joined him. Their music floated over the chaos, a beacon of peace in the storm. Passengers gathered near the stern, the only part of the ship still above water. Anna was among them. She clung to the railing, her eyes scanning the crowd. She hoped to see Peter, even though she knew he was far away in a lifeboat. The Titanic groaned as the weight of the water pulled it down. The deck tilted sharply, and people screamed. Some jumped into the freezing sea, hoping to survive. Others held on to railings, praying for a miracle. Amidst the fear, there were acts of kindness. A man took off his coat and gave it to a shivering woman. An officer helped an elderly couple climb to higher ground. Even in the face of death, some people chose courage over fear. Anna closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. The ship's lights flickered, then went out. Darkness surrounded her. The Titanic's journey was ending, but her fight for survival was just beginning. Chapter 8. Personal Stories. The Titanic was sinking and time was running out. Amidst the chaos, passengers faced impossible choices. Every person had a story, and on this terrible night, those stories became unforgettable. John was a young third-class passenger. He had come from Ireland with his mother and little sister, hoping for a new life in America. They had dreamed of starting fresh, but now their dreams seemed far away. John held his sister's hand as they pushed through the crowd on the lower deck. "Stay close," he told her. His mother followed behind, clutching a small bag with their most important belongings. When they reached the lifeboat station, an officer shouted, "Women and children only." John froze. His mother looked at him, her face pale. "I can't leave you," she said. "You have to," John insisted. His voice shook, but he tried to sound strong. "I'll find another way. You and Mary go, please." His mother hesitated, but the officer urged her forward. John helped her and Mary into the lifeboat. His little sister started to cry. "Don't go," she wailed, reaching for him. John leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Be brave," he whispered. "I'll see you soon. I promise." The lifeboat began to lower. John stepped back, watching as it disappeared into the dark, icy water. He clenched his fists and looked around. He had no plan, but he wasn't giving up. In first class, Lady Astor stood on the deck with her husband, Colonel Astor. She wore a fur coat and held a small dog in her arms. The officers urged her to board a lifeboat, but she shook her head. "I won't leave without you," she said firmly. "You must," Colonel Astor replied. He placed his hands on her shoulders. "The lifeboats are for women and children. You'll be safe." Tears filled Lady Astor's eyes. "You'll follow, won't you?" she asked. Colonel Astor nodded, though they both knew the truth. There weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. He reached for her hand and kissed it gently. "I love you," he said. Lady Astor hugged her little dog tightly as she stepped into the lifeboat. She looked up at her husband one last time as the boat was lowered. The cold wind bit at her face, but the pain in her heart was worse. Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's designer, stood in the first-class smoking room. He looked calm, but his mind raced. He had checked the damage himself. He knew the ship was doomed. Yet he stayed behind. A steward entered the room. "Sir, you should get to a lifeboat," he said urgently. Andrews shook his head. "There aren't enough," he said quietly. "The passengers come first." He moved through the ship, helping wherever he could. He gave directions to confused passengers. He handed out life jackets and urged people to stay calm. When a young woman cried, he placed his hand on her shoulder. "You'll be fine," he said. His voice was steady, even though he knew his fate. Near the bow, a group of musicians played their instruments. Wallace Hartley led them, his violin resting under his chin. The music was soft and calm. The passengers nearby stopped to listen. One of the musicians lowered his bow and looked at Hartley. "Should we go?" he asked. His voice trembled. Hartley shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "They need us." He began to play a hymn, and the others joined in. The music floated over the chaos, bringing comfort to those who heard it. A woman holding her baby paused and wiped her tears. A young man whispered a prayer. The music was a small light in the darkness. Anna moved through the crowd, searching desperately for another lifeboat. She thought of Peter, safe in the boat she had placed him in. Her heart ached to see him again. She spotted a group of people near a lifeboat. An officer shouted, "Only 2 more." A mother and her son climbed in. The lifeboat lowered, leaving Anna behind once again. Her shoulders slumped, but she refused to give up. She saw a man helping passengers. He was young, with kind eyes and rough hands. He turned to her and said, "There's a collapsible boat on the other side. Hurry." Anna nodded and followed him, weaving through the panicked crowd. When they reached the collapsible lifeboat, it was surrounded by people. The crew struggled to free it from the ropes. The man stepped forward to help. "You can do this," he told the crew. Together, they worked to lower the boat. When it was ready, he turned to Anna. "You go first." "What about you?" she asked. "I'll wait for another," he said. "Go." Anna climbed into the boat. As it lowered into the sea, she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said softly. John wandered the deck, looking for another way to survive. He saw people jumping into the water, their faces pale with fear. The icy sea was a death sentence for most. He turned away, unwilling to give up hope. He reached the stern where many passengers had gathered. The ship tilted sharply now, and the deck was difficult to stand on. A man nearby helped an elderly woman hold onto the railing. Another gave his coat to a shivering child. John joined a group trying to free another collapsible lifeboat. The ropes were stuck, but they didn't stop. He pulled with all his strength, his hands burning from the cold. The boat finally came loose and slid into the water. John looked at it longingly, but stepped back. He saw a young girl standing alone, her face streaked with tears. "Here," he said, lifting her into the boat. "Stay safe." The girl's mother appeared and hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. John nodded and turned away. He wasn't sure what would happen to him, but he felt at peace. He had done the right thing. The Titanic groaned as the weight of the water pulled it down. The stern rose higher into the air. The ship's lights flickered, then went out. Darkness fell over the sea. John gripped the railing, his heart pounding. He whispered a prayer, thinking of his mother and sister. Anna held tightly to the edge of her lifeboat, tears streaming down her face. Lady Astor sat quietly, clutching her little dog, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon. Every passenger carried their own story, their own hopes and fears. On that cold, quiet night, those stories became part of history. Chapter 9. The Titanic's Final Moments. The Titanic was dying. The ship that once seemed so strong was now sinking into the icy Atlantic. The bow, the front of the ship, sank deeper into the water. The stern, the back, lifted high into the air. The ship groaned and creaked under the enormous pressure. People clung to the railings, their faces pale with fear. On the lifeboats, survivors watched helplessly. They could hear the cries from the ship, faint but desperate. Anna sat in her lifeboat, her hands trembling. She held onto the edge, her eyes fixed on the Titanic. Somewhere on that sinking ship was John, the brave young man who had helped her. And others too, passengers who hadn't made it to the lifeboats. Her heart ached for them. The sea was black and still. The air was freezing. Some passengers jumped from the ship into the icy water, hoping to swim to safety. The cold hit them like knives. Their cries filled the night, then faded as the cold overtook them. The water was a silent enemy, claiming lives quickly. On the Titanic's deck, chaos grew. Some passengers ran, trying to find a way off the ship. Others stood still, too shocked to move. The crew shouted instructions, but few listened. A man clung to a railing, his hands shaking. "This can't be happening," he whispered. His voice was drowned out by the noise around him. The lights on the Titanic flickered. They had been a source of comfort, but now they wavered. Shadows danced on the deck as the lights grew dimmer. Then, with a final flicker, the lights went out. Darkness fell over the ship. The band had stopped playing. Wallace Hartley and the musicians stood silently, their instruments in their hands. They had done their best to bring comfort, but now there was nothing left to do. Wallace looked at his violin and closed his eyes. He had played for the passengers until the very end. At the stern, a group of people gathered. They held onto the railings, their knuckles white. Among them was John. He had tried to find another way to survive, but failed. Now, he stood with strangers, all united by fear. The ship tilted more, and the deck became hard to stand on. "Hold on!" someone shouted. John thought of his mother and sister in the lifeboat. He had promised to find them. But now, he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. He whispered a prayer, his breath visible in the icy air. The Titanic's bow plunged deeper, pulling the stern higher into the sky. The ship was nearly vertical now. Passengers and crew clung to anything they could find. Some lost their grip and slid down the deck screaming. Others held on, their faces full of terror. Anna couldn't look away. The ship was disappearing before her eyes. The lifeboat rocked gently on the waves, but her heart felt heavy. She clutched her coat tightly, trying to block out the cries from the ship. She thought of Peter, safe beside her, and felt a mix of relief and sorrow. A loud, deep sound echoed across the sea. The Titanic was breaking apart. The ship groaned like a giant in pain. Metal screeched and cracked. The stern shook violently as it broke free from the bow. Passengers screamed as the ship split in two. The bow sank quickly, vanishing beneath the waves. The stern floated for a moment, then began to fall. John tightened his grip on the railing. The world tilted tilted around him. The stern was falling fast now, pulling everything with it. He felt weightless for a moment as the ship plunged into the water. Cold rushed over him, sharp and unforgiving. He gasped for air, his body numb. From the lifeboats, the survivors watched in silence. The Titanic, once so grand and powerful, was gone. The sea swallowed it, leaving behind only small pieces of debris. The cries of those still in the water pierced the night. Anna leaned over the side of her lifeboat, her eyes scanning the dark waves. She hoped to see John. She hoped to see anyone. Lady Astor held her little dog close. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the empty space where the Titanic had been. Beside her, a young boy sobbed, calling for his father. His mother wrapped her arms around him, but her face was blank with shock. The freezing water was deadly. Survivors clung to whatever they could find. Pieces of wood, overturned lifeboats, even suitcases. John found a wooden plank and held onto it tightly. His body shook violently, the cold sinking deep into his bones. He felt his strength fading. He closed his eyes and thought of his family. "Stay awake," he whispered to himself. "Stay awake." In the distance, a light appeared. It was the RMS Carpathia, racing to help. The survivors in the lifeboats saw it and felt a flicker of hope. "Over here!" someone shouted, waving a flashlight. The lifeboats began to move toward the light. Anna's lifeboat rocked gently as the passengers rowed. She stared at the light, her hands gripping the edge. "We're going to make it," she whispered. But her thoughts turned to those left behind, the ones who had no chance to escape. The Titanic's final moments were over, but its story was not. The survivors carried it with them, the fear, the loss, and the memories of those they loved. For Anna, John, and many others, the night would haunt them forever. Chapter 10. Rescued at Dawn. The cold night felt endless. The survivors in the lifeboats sat in silence, their bodies shaking. The icy wind bit at their faces, and their clothes were soaked with freezing water. Some held hands, trying to comfort one another. Others stared blankly at the dark sea, too tired to speak. Anna huddled next to Peter in their lifeboat. She wrapped her arms around him, trying to keep him warm. His small body trembled, and his lips were blue. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. Her voice shook, but she tried to sound strong. "We'll be okay, Peter." The lifeboat rocked gently on the waves. Around them, the ocean was eerily quiet. Pieces of debris floated nearby, chairs, suitcases, even a broken door. Anna avoided looking at the dark water, afraid of what she might see. In another lifeboat, Lady Astor sat holding her little dog. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the horizon. She couldn't stop thinking about her husband. His last words echoed in her mind. "You must go." She had obeyed, but the guilt weighed heavily on her heart. Beside her, a young woman whispered softly to her baby. The child's cries had stopped, but the mother kept rocking him, humming a lullaby. Her hands were red and raw from the cold, but she didn't stop. Far away, a light appeared on the horizon. At first it was faint, just a tiny speck in the darkness, but as the minutes passed, it grew brighter. One of the survivors shouted, "A ship! There's a ship!" Heads turned toward the light. The lifeboats came alive with whispers of hope. Some passengers wept openly, their tears freezing on their cheeks. Others waved their arms or held up flashlights, trying to signal the approaching ship. It was the RMS Carpathia. The small rescue ship had received the Titanic's distress call and had sailed through icy waters to help. Its crew worked quickly, preparing blankets, food, and warm drinks for the survivors. The first lifeboat reached the Carpathia as dawn began to break. The sky turned a soft gray, and the sun's faint light revealed the frozen faces of the survivors. Crew members leaned over the side of the ship, helping people aboard. Anna's lifeboat was next. She gripped Peter's hand tightly as they approached the Carpathia. A crew member reached down and lifted Peter into his arms. Anna followed, her legs shaking as she stepped onto the deck. The warmth of the ship hit her like a wave, and she almost collapsed. "Are you all right?" a kind voice asked. Anna nodded, though tears filled her eyes. The crew wrapped blankets around her and Peter. A woman offered Anna a cup of hot tea. The warmth spread through her hands, but her heart still felt cold. John was among the last to reach the Carpathia. He clung to a wooden plank in the freezing water, too weak to climb into a lifeboat. A crew member spotted him and threw down a rope. "Hold on!" the man shouted. With the last of his strength, John grabbed the rope. The crew pulled him aboard, wrapping him in blankets. In his arms, he held a small baby. The child was not his, but he had found her floating on a piece of debris. He had promised himself he would save her. A nurse rushed over and took the baby from John's arms. "You're a hero," she said softly. John shook his head. "I just did what I could," he whispered. On the deck of the Carpathia, survivors huddled together. Some cried for their lost loved ones. Others sat silently, staring at the endless ocean. A man held his head in his hands, whispering a prayer. A young woman leaned against the railing, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Lady Astor stood by the rail, looking out at the sea. She clutched her dog tightly, her eyes scanning the horizon. She hoped, foolishly, to see her husband's face among the survivors, but she knew he was gone. Her heart ached with loss. Inside the ship, the crew worked tirelessly. They handed out warm drinks and dry clothes. Doctors treated frostbite and hypothermia. A young boy cried as a nurse bandaged his frozen fingers. "Will they be okay?" he asked. The nurse nodded, though her own hands trembled. Anna sat on a bench, holding Peter close. He had fallen asleep, his small body finally warm. She stroked his hair and whispered, "We made it, Peter. We're safe now." But her thoughts turned to those who hadn't made it, the friends she had met in third class, the kind strangers who had helped her. She wondered about John and hoped he was alive. As the Carpathia sailed toward New York, the survivors began to share their stories. Some spoke of the chaos on the Titanic's deck. Others described the freezing water and the terrifying wait for rescue. Their voices were heavy with emotion, their faces lined with grief. John sat quietly, listening to the others. The baby he had saved was safe now, sleeping in the arms of a nurse. He thought of his mother and sister. He had kept his promise to survive, but he didn't know if they were alive. The uncertainty gnawed at him. The Carpathia reached New York days later. Crowds gathered at the dock, waiting anxiously for news. Journalists scribbled notes as the first survivors stepped off the ship. Family members searched the faces, hoping to see their loved ones. Anna and Peter walked down the gangway, their hands tightly clasped. A kind man from the ship's crew helped them into a waiting car. "You're safe now," he said gently. Anna nodded, though her eyes filled with tears. She didn't feel safe yet. Not completely. The Titanic was gone, but its story would never be forgotten. The survivors carried it with them, the fear, the loss, and the memories of those who had perished. They had witnessed both the best and worst of humanity. Acts of courage, moments of love, and the deep, silent grief of loss. For Anna, John, Lady Astor, and so many others, the night of April 15th, 1912, would stay with them forever. It had changed their lives. It had changed the world. Chapter 11. A World in Mourning. The world woke to shocking news on April 15th, 1912. The Titanic, the grandest ship ever built, was gone. The unsinkable ship had sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic. Over 1,500 lives were lost. The tragedy stunned everyone. In cities and towns across the world, people read the headlines with disbelief. "Titanic sinks!" the newspapers cried. Families gathered around, their hands shaking as they read the details. Some had loved ones on board. They prayed for their survival. Others wept openly, their worst fears confirmed. In New York, crowds gathered at the docks, waiting for the RMS Carpathia. Survivors stepped off the ship, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. Reporters surrounded them, asking questions. What happened? Could it have been prevented? The survivors struggled to answer. Many were too tired to speak. Some cried as they recalled the screams in the dark, the freezing water, and the terrible silence after the Titanic disappeared. Their stories painted a picture of horror and heartbreak. Lady Astor stood on the dock, clutching her little dog. Her clothes were neat, but her face was pale. She refused to speak to reporters, her grief too deep for words. She walked away quietly, her head bowed. She had lost her husband, and no words could bring him back. Anna held Peter's hand tightly as they stepped off the Carpathia. The crowd was overwhelming, but she kept moving. She had no one waiting for her, but she held on to hope. They were alive, and that was what mattered. In England, families waited for news. Mothers held on to their children, praying that their husbands had survived. Fathers paced back and forth, their faces tight with worry. In small villages and big cities, people gathered in churches to pray for the missing. One woman in Southampton clutched a letter from her son, John. He had written to her from the Titanic, full of excitement for his new life in America. Now she sat by the window, staring out at the empty street. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. Newspapers around the world asked the same question. How could this happen? The Titanic was supposed to be the safest ship ever built. It had the latest technology, the strongest materials, and the most experienced crew. Yet, it had sunk on its first voyage. Experts pointed to the iceberg, but others blamed human decisions. The ship had been traveling too fast. The lifeboats were not enough for everyone on board. Warnings about ice had been ignored. Slowly, the story of mistakes and overconfidence began to emerge. In the days that followed, stories of bravery and love spread. People spoke of the band that played until the end, of crew members who helped passengers, even as they knew they wouldn't survive, of parents who gave up their places in lifeboats to save their children. One story was about a young man named John. He had helped his mother and sister into a lifeboat before the ship sank. Later, he was found clinging to a piece of wood in the freezing water. He was alive, but many others were not. The sinking of the Titanic changed the world. It wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol of human ambition, of the belief that technology could conquer anything, even nature. But the tragedy showed that this belief had limits. The sea was vast and powerful, and humans were still small. People questioned the choices that had been made. Why were there so few lifeboats? Why was the ship traveling so fast? Why had the warnings been ignored? These questions led to changes in the way ships were designed and operated. New safety rules were created. Ships had to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Ice patrols were set up to watch for icebergs in the North Atlantic. Wireless operators were required to listen for distress signals at all times. These changes saved lives in the years to come. For the survivors, life would never be the same. They carried the memories of that terrible night with them. Anna often thought of the people she had met on the Titanic, the friends she had made in third class, the kind man who had helped her find a lifeboat. She wondered if he had survived. Lady Astor spent the rest of her life mourning her husband. She rarely spoke about the Titanic, but her sadness was clear. Her little dog was her only comfort, a reminder of the life she had lost. In the years that followed, the Titanic became a legend. Books were written about it. Songs were sung. People told stories of the ship that was too proud, too confident, and the lesson it left behind. But for those who had been there, it wasn't just a story. It was a memory of bravery, love, and loss. It was a night when the world seemed to stop, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 12. Lessons from the Deep. The Titanic rests at the bottom of the Atlantic. It lies over 3,800 meters below the surface, hidden in the cold, dark sea. For many years, no one knew exactly where it was. The ship that had once been full of life and dreams was now a silent wreck, a graveyard for over 1,500 souls. In 1985, a team of explorers found the Titanic. They used special technology to search the ocean floor. When they finally saw the ship through their cameras, the world held its breath. There it was, the Titanic. Broken in two, but still majestic. Its bow pointed into the seabed. Its stern lay shattered, surrounded by pieces of the past, shoes, dishes, and even jewelry. The discovery brought both joy and sadness. People were excited to see the Titanic again, but they were also reminded of the tragedy. "It's more than a shipwreck," one explorer said. "It's a part of history, a story of bravery, love, and loss." The Titanic story has never been forgotten. For many, it is a symbol of human ambition. People had called it unsinkable. They believed they had built something that could not fail, but the iceberg proved them wrong. Nature was stronger. This story reminds us of human strength and weakness. It shows how brave people can be in the face of danger. It also shows the dangers of pride and overconfidence. The Titanic was a warning to the world. After the Titanic sank, the world changed. New safety rules were created to protect passengers on ships. Every ship had to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Ice patrols began to watch the North Atlantic, warning ships about dangerous icebergs. Wireless operators were required to stay on duty at all times, listening for calls of distress. These changes saved countless lives. Every year, ships crossed the Atlantic safely because of the lessons learned from the Titanic. The tragedy inspired people to do better. The Titanic also became a story of bravery. People still talk about the musicians who played until the end. They gave comfort to passengers in their final moments, the crew who helped others, even though they knew they wouldn't survive. The parents who sacrificed their own lives to save their children. These acts of courage are remembered with respect and admiration. Anna never forgot her journey on the Titanic. She and Peter built a new life in America, but the memories stayed with her. She often thought of the people she had met on the ship, the friends she had made in third class, the kind man who had helped her onto the lifeboat. She wondered what had happened to him. She wondered if he had survived. Every year, on April 15th, Anna lit a candle for the Titanic. She told Peter stories about the ship, about its beauty, about its tragedy. "We must never forget," she said. "It's not just about the ship. It's about the people, the ones we lost, and the ones who survived." The discovery of the Titanic in 1985 brought new interest to the story. People wanted to learn more about the ship and the people who had been aboard. Books were written, films were made, museums displayed items from the Titanic, like plates, life jackets, and even letters. One letter, written by a passenger named Sarah, was found near the wreck. It read, "This ship is so grand. I feel like I'm dreaming." The letter ended with the words, "We sail tomorrow. I can't wait for our new life in America." Sarah didn't survive, but her words lived on. They reminded people of the hope and excitement that had filled the Titanic's decks before the tragedy struck. Today, people from all over the world visit memorials to honor the Titanic. In Belfast, where the ship was built, there is a large museum that tells its story. Visitors can walk through exhibits that show what life was like on board. They can see photos, videos, and even parts of the ship itself. At the memorial in Southampton, where many crew members lived, the names of the lost are carved into stone. Families bring flowers to remember their loved ones. The names tell a story of courage and sacrifice. The Titanic is more than just a shipwreck. It is a lesson for humanity. It shows us the importance of safety. It teaches us to respect nature's power. And it reminds us of the strength and love people can show in difficult times. For those who survived, the Titanic was a turning point. Their lives were forever changed by that cold night in April 1912. But they carried the memory of the ship with them, passing it on to future generations. When explorers found the Titanic, they left a plaque near the wreck. It reads, "In memory of those who lost their lives on April 15th, 1912, may they rest in peace." The Titanic may be gone, but its story lives on. It reminds us of the past and inspires us to build a safer, kinder future. The Ship of Dreams became a lesson for the world, a lesson never to be forgotten.